It's estimated that tens of thousands of British men are raising children that they believe to be their own, but aren't. It's known as paternity fraud. Yeah, I hadn't heard of it either, but it often involves a woman failing to admit that the child is the result of an affair. Now, around 4% of children are thought to be the result of paternity fraud. That's one child in every classroom, if you extrapolate it out. Now, this morning we want to hear from you. Have you discovered that a child isn't yours? 2/3 of paternity tests reveal the assumed father is indeed the biological father. But if you've taken a test, we'd love to hear from you this morning. Perhaps you didn't quite get the result that you were expecting, or perhaps you've hidden the real identity of your child's father, the flip side of it all. 0500 909 693 if you want to get in touch with me this morning. The text number is 85058. Really like to hear your stories on this morning. Let's speak to Professor Mark Bellis, who's the Director of the Centre for Public Health at Liverpool John Moores University. An expert in all of this, describes the issue of paternity fraud as a ticking time bomb. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us this morning. And we could also speak to Edward. Edward doesn't want to use his surname. He's had 2 daughters, 1 son with his ex-wife, but discovered that he wasn't the biological father of his youngest daughter. Good morning to you, Edward.
Good morning, Chris.
Thanks so much for agreeing to speak to us. Let's just try and get your story in full if we can, and let's go back to the start. Just take us back to the point in your life when all of this was happening. As I say, you were married and a child was born. What were your overall circumstances at that time in terms of your relationship and in terms of the rest of the family?
The relationship with my wife and 2 children plus the new one on the way, who was born approximately 29 years ago, was quite good. We were sort of happy. We had our usual ups and downs, the families do. And but when my daughter was about 4 years old, my wife and I separated. We've been together for about 12 years, separated, and that was that. And I carried on supporting my wife financially and seeing the children as regular as possible. And at that time my daughter was 4, and life carried on, and I found a new wife, if you like. We went through divorce and everything else. And when my youngest daughter was 17, going through her teenage years, which I know is a tough time for a lot of parents, fortunately I didn't have to deal with most of it. She wasn't living with me, she was living with her mum. They ended up in an argument, and the argument was things like whatever mums and daughters argue about.
Yeah, sure.
And my wife said, "Oh, you've got your father's temper, and you've got his terrible eyes when you shout and scream and all that," which we haven't. And my daughter told me this story and said that I've since found out I don't think I'm your daughter, you're my dad. And I says, well, one of the problems we have in this world is it's difficult to get to the truth. And there was an opportunity about going through DNA.
Well, let's get to that in a second, because I want to hear your thoughts of how you approached that and how you felt directly afterwards. But just rewinding a little bit,
yes.
Did you have any reason to believe at any stage that she wasn't your child until that point, until she started suggesting otherwise? Because everyone says my baby. I've got a 6-month-old baby. Everyone says she's the absolute spit of me. There's no doubt. I mean, presumably she wouldn't have looked like you, so presumably there might have been a degree of suspicion early on?
No, I never had I'll give an example. When she was born 29 years ago, I remember picking her up the day old, and I looked at her, little baby, little tiny thing, which looks nothing like anybody apart from baby. And I said to myself, and I said to I think it was a friend, I said, I don't think this is my little girl. And he says, what makes you say that? I said, oh, I don't know, I'm being stupid. And that was, it was just a shock. I mean, she was a surprise, if you like. The other 2 were more planned and this one wasn't. There's a gap of about 10 years between the other 2 and her. So she's almost become like an only child because of the age difference. And that was the end of it. And I mentioned to my wife, oh, she's not mine, she's a pain. She's crying a lot, can't be mine, except when they're asleep. Did
you mention that more than once, or was it just that passing conversation? Because I would imagine if you said it more than once, your wife might have started reacting in a particular way as well.
No, she just poo-pooed me, and I said she was right. And I brought it up a few years later, just as a thought, but it was a passing thought, and it's me being stupid and I don't neglectful, I suppose you could say. But that was it, and I never thought anything of it again. And then even when we were going through divorce and all the finances were sorted out, never considered it at all, never thought about it.
So I'm still just trying to get clearer in my mind. Just explain to me a little bit more about, when it began formulating in your mind that everything wasn't quite right. This was your daughter herself said to you,
Yes, I mean, I went through that sort of phase, which is not mine, especially when they're crying a lot at night.
Sure.
But that was it, the end of, and I had 3 children, I had a wife, we'd had our ups and downs, usual things. But then what happened was I used to see my daughter regularly at weekends, every weekend, especially on Sunday. And when she got to the teenage years, she wanted to see me less. It was her own life, of course. And then when she got to 17, there was this big bust up with her mother.
Yes.
And then she came to see me, and I was with my wife, my new wife of now 20-odd years, who was a counsellor at the time. So she knew about these sort of emotional things, which I'm not into. And we sat down, and my daughter was crying a lot, telling me about this argument about mother accusing I wasn't the father, all these sorts of things coming out. And I sat there, and they had the flashback of her birth, and mentioned this thing about DNA, because we know that my ex-wife used to lie a lot, tell lots of stories, but the trouble is there's always an element of doubt, possible truth, and so on. And I sat with her, and she didn't know what to do, and I didn't know what to do, and I said, well, at least we can get to the truth, which I think is this thing called DNA.
Yes, but it seems extraordinary that there was the sort of foresight and suspicion of a 17-year-old girl that led you to start thinking that not everything was right. I would have expected that to have come from you.
No, not at all. I mean, maybe call me stupid. I don't know. I mean, I'm a family man. I enjoy my family. It's like at the moment now I've got 6 children and I've got 12 grandchildren from my wife and all that. It's fantastic. But this didn't cross my mind. I was working hard, paying off my wife the maintenance money, looking after the children. That's what I enjoyed. I never dreamt of that. Never thought, well, basically, I never thought no individual human being who once loved me, called my ex-wife, who had a daughter, would lie to something like that. It's a terrible lie to live with. How can you live with that?
Of course. So in the end, in this kind of collaborative way, as you're describing, you went down the route of a DNA test. How did that work?
Well, I heard about this DNA. I mean, we've all read about it. It was all very exciting. The exciting side of the science. Spoke to my daughter, and we agreed that we wanted to do it to get to the truth. Either way, just to get to know. The outcome was important. The truth. So I did some research on the internet and the early days we're going back 12 years, so it was perhaps early days, I'm not sure. And I found a few websites, and there was something here called a DNA test, where a kit was sent to your GP, you paid a lump of money. So I went ahead and did it, and I sat with my daughter, we talked about it, we agreed to it, so I paid the money, and sure enough, a kit arrived at the GP practice a week or so later. Then I arranged an appointment with the GP, the doctor. Now, because it was just myself and my daughter, they had to take extra blood. I'm not sure about DNA. It wasn't both parents, but anyway, it was just my blood and her blood. Went to the doctor, blood was taken in the GP practice. We signed documents proving whose blood it was and so on. And that kit was sent off, and that was the end of it. And about 2 or 3 weeks later, a letter arrives. One to my daughter, one to me, basically saying that the chances of her being your daughter was negligible in terms of percentages, which proved that she was not my daughter.
And how, go back to that day, how did you feel when you opened that letter and read those details?
Well, I know I was totally devastated, shocked, but whatever words they were, I was devastated that something like this had happened, that she was not my daughter. She had a similar letter, and we talked on the phone and met up, and I said to her, and I still believe today, she might not be biologically my daughter, but I still love her. And at the time of her being 17, she was still a bit of a pain, but she's come through that teenage years, and she's still my daughter.
But has it changed? I mean, it's difficult to know how it would have changed your relationship, isn't it? Because you don't know what it would have been like otherwise. But how is your relationship with her compared to the relationship you have with your other children from that marriage?
Well, okay, currently our relationship is a little bit strained, but it's only been the last year. But generally, it's been okay.
So that's other factors, is it?
Oh, there's other factors,
yeah.
Definitely. But no, it has changed. It has scarred me. It has scarred her. And what I thought about after all of this, when you come through all your own personal emotions, I was thinking of her as a 17-year-old suddenly discovering that I'm not her dad. It must have been worse for her more than for me. I don't know. I'm assuming that. Especially at 17, that age group. And then her mother said to her, admitted that I was not the father, and that he was this father. This other chap was her father. So my ex knew who the father was. It wasn't one of these one-night stands and she wasn't sure. She appeared to be definitely sure that this other person was my daughter's father.
And Edward, how did you go about, telling other people in your life, other friends and, acquaintances? Did you feel embarrassed? Did you feel foolish that you had been duped for so long?
I think a good word is foolish, stupid, duped, those sorts of words. And everybody asked me, how do you feel about your daughter now? And I said, well, it actually hasn't changed, although there is a mark there. There is obviously a subtle change. I suppose it's very much, the way I consider it is having an adopted child. You still love them in the same way, but it's obviously not your blood. But she's still my daughter. Whether I like her or dislike her at the moment, she is still my daughter. I feel responsible.
And that's the thing. You still went through all of those feelings that any father has. The bond that develops through the familiarity, absolutely. Those moments of magic you have when you hold them and they hug you, and all of that. You still went through all of that. Edward, stay with us. It's been fascinating, and thank you for being so open and revealing with your story. Stay with us, because we're going to continue to talk about this, and we're going to continue to talk about it with Professor Mark Bellis as well, an expert in this area, director of the Centre for Public Health at Liverpool John Moores University, and we're getting your texts and calls on this as well. And this morning, for the first hour of the show, we are talking about paternity fraud. This is where men are raising children they believe to be their own, but aren't. It's estimated there's tens of thousands of British men in that situation right now. 0500 909 693. I want to hear from you this morning. Have you discovered a child isn't yours? Perhaps you've hidden the real identity of your child's father. 85058. A couple of texts. Roger in Wolverhampton says, hello, I just found out that 2 children I believe were mine are in fact not. Both boys have different fathers, and I'm not one of them. It's always been a family joke that the boys do not look like anybody in our families. A joke I'm sure that's not so funny now. This is an ugly phone-in topic, says another text. If I was with someone I loved and they had a baby, I'd love them both no matter who the father was. This phone-in is about property rights, not love. Anyway, paternity fraud goes both ways too. There must be lots of unmarried fathers with no paternal responsibilities. Go after them. Just a couple of your views this morning. Professor Mark Bellis, as I say, the director of the Centre for Public Health at Liverpool John Moores University. Thanks for hanging on for us, Professor. These figures, we're talking about an estimated tens of thousands, around 4% of children thought to be the result of paternity fraud. As we were saying, that's one child in every classroom. Where do you get those kind of figures from?
Well, there are very few studies, well, practically none, that have directly measured this, but there are a variety of genetic studies which have inadvertently, when they're looking at genetic diseases or heritability of different genetic patterns, have inadvertently uncovered levels of paternal discrepancy or paternity problems. If you put all those together, you get a figure of around 4%. And to put that in perspective, in England and Wales, there's about 700,000 births a year. That would mean about 26,000 births would be attributed to the wrong father.
Okay, and in most cases, are we talking about, there will be men, presumably, in those statistics who go their entire lives without ever finding out the truth, of course. But then on the flip side, there must be fathers who've always been a little bit suspicious. I just wonder how the truth in those cases most of the time outs. Is it because the father has always had some kind of suspicion, or is it like we heard with Edward's case, that sometimes the children are the ones that bring it to the fore?
Well, this is changing very quickly. We're seeing, over the last couple of decades, we've seen huge increases in the numbers of people who are going for paternity tests. And even recently now, with big high street names providing paternity tests, it's becoming more and more accessible. So in the past, what this used to really be was a suspicion that may have caused stress and problems in the family. It may not even have been talked about. The reality is now that people can, for £100, go out and get some certainty about which children actually are and aren't theirs. And fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, this opportunity is being taken up more and more.
Can we assume by the time that happens, by the time it gets to a point where a paternity test is decided to be the way forward, the relationship in most of those cases is over?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, it could be that the paternity test could be the end to a piece of stress, that there may have been some discussion. It may just be the piece of proof someone needs. Obviously, in those relationships, something is wrong. Often the paternity test is looked at as something bad, but of course, in some circumstances, it may confirm the paternity of the father. The problem at the moment is that the more we know about DNA, the more important it now is becoming, not just for the father and mother, but for the child to know who their parents are as well.
Yeah, and I suppose there's the undercurrent here is that the reason that perhaps the truth is being kept back from a father is what? I mean, in some cases, people are going to say it's due to financial concerns, presumably.
Well, of course, there may be financial concerns. There may be worries about all sorts of things in the family. And the cost of raising a child, I think, is now over a child up to about 21 is about £200,000 on average. So that's an enormous financial concern. But the information the mother may not know in some circumstances, and in some circumstances there may have been more than one partner at the same time. So there may be some uncertainty on both sides. So there's a whole variety of reasons why that information may not come out. The reality now is, though, that, as I said, as you know more and more, we've got to think of the child, and that the balance is changing, so that there's more importance in a child knowing its family's genetic history, what things it may be at risk of health-wise later in life.
Let's speak to Anthony, who's in Buxton, who's given us a call. Morning, Anthony.
Good morning.
This happened to you. You found out your son wasn't yours when, he was just getting towards his teenage years.
Yeah, he was 12 years old when I found out. I could feel that something wasn't right. My son wasn't growing to look more like me. He was growing to look less like me, and his mother's behaviour was wrong. So there were signs that were there. I said to my wife one night, I said, for all I know, my son's not mine. And she said, well, look, I've never said anything to you, but, she's thought it. So I went and did a DNA test, got one off the internet. I did the test, and the results came back that no, there was absolutely no chance that I was his biological father. My son was, the first grandchild, first great-grandchild, first great-great-grandchild in my family. So, he was absolutely cherished. So I had to tell my mother. So I went round to my mother's home and, told her what happened. And she told me that she already knew. She'd known for 2 weeks. She'd done a DNA test herself. And the reason she'd done the DNA test was because the guy that is his biological father had found out that he was his biological father. Some friends of his had seen him, what they thought was his son in the street, and said, I'd seen your boy. He said, I don't have a son. They said, I'm telling you, that's your son. They'd seen him with the mother. They knew the relationship that those guys had over a 12-year period. Said, I'm telling you, there's no way that's not yours. That's not your child. So he knew where my brother worked. He approached my brother and said, look, I am, your brother's, your nephew's father. He took one look at the guy and knew it was the truth. He told my mother, and she performed a DNA test between my youngest son and my biological son. And obviously it came back, there was no way. So she'd known for 2 weeks and didn't know how to tell me.
How did your mother go about getting the DNA? I mean, because for a 12-year-old boy, that must have been quite
same thing. I think it was a mouth swab.
Yeah.
I think it was a mouth swab. But in basically one day, I found out that my son wasn't my biological son, and I found out who it was, and she'd got a photograph of the guy, and from one look at the photograph, I knew that it was the truth, that this was the man that was his biological father. And so,
just kind of fast forwarding a bit, what's it meant for your relationship with the boy you thought was your son?
Well, my relationship with my son is strong. Because basically we went to court. The court said, no, you can't see your son, because at the time his mother had kept him away from me for 6 months. He'd only got one side of the story. And so, he thought, I don't know if he thought, that maybe his dad would want him, but that's not the truth. That's not the case. I love my son, and I want my boy. I'm always going to be his dad. That's all there is to it. it's hard. I mean, I go and find him in the parks and we talk, and so. But my son, I asked him if he wanted to come away with me this summer on holiday, and yes, he did. And spoke to his mum. Yes, yeah, all right. She gave him the signals that yes, he could come, and when it came to it, and no, she stopped him at the last minute. So I know, in the next couple of years, once my son's old enough to defy his mother, that he will come. But I mean, she's robbed him of these years of his family. Half of his family's just been snatched away from him, and there was no need for it.
Anthony, thank you. Appreciate you getting in touch this morning. Anthony in Buxton. Just going back to you, Professor Mark Bellis. I mean, obviously the stories we're going to generally hear this morning are going to be stories from the parents and the impact it's had on them psychologically and in terms of how their family works. But of course, the impact on the child involved. How would you begin to sit down and explain that to a child once the truth is out?
Well, I mean, I think this is one of the questions we need to answer. I mean, that caller showed just how much of a family is affected. So this figure of 4%, if we take that as an example, that's just the number of children affected. But you've got the whole wider family around that. Sitting down and talking to the child, people are discussing, genetic counsellors and others, about how that might be done. But we don't know enough because the studies haven't been done about the consequences and the best ways of handling these issues. The problem is that we've got a problem everybody's very uncomfortable with, and that's stopping us understanding the best ways of dealing with it because we haven't got the sorts of information we might have on a whole range of other social conditions.
Okay, we'll leave it there, but thanks very much indeed for your time. It's been very revealing stuff. Professor Mark Bellis, who's the Director of the Centre for Public Health at Liverpool John Moores University, and I'm not sure if Edward's still there, but thank you, Edward, as well. We heard his story. He had 2 daughters and 1 son with his ex-wife, had discovered he wasn't the biological father of his youngest daughter. A few more of your texts on 85058. Mark, who's in London. I only found out that my father isn't my biological father 5 years ago after applying for my passport. It doesn't change a thing, he says. I was 27 then. Dave in Worcester. I found out when I was 15 that my dad was not my father, and he was also not my brother's father. Added to that is that my brother has a different father to me. I have since met my father, so that's a complicated situation for them. And Fran, that caller that said this is an ugly phone-in, is missing the point. It's not about your partner having a child with someone else. It's about them lying about it. If the truth was told, then an informed decision could be made by the other party. Keep your thoughts coming in on this. 85058 0500 909 693 if you want to give us a call this morning. It's just coming up to 10:33. Estimated that tens of thousands of British men are raising children that they believe to be their own, but who aren't. Paternity fraud is the name given to this, often involving a woman failing to admit that the child is the result of an affair. And the figures that we have, not much research been done into this, but the suggestion is around 4% of children are thought to be the result of this. One child in every classroom. Dave in Worthing, good morning to you.
Good morning.
You discovered that your son wasn't actually your son after all.
That's true. When he was just coming up to 4, I guess, and it was during the process of getting divorced I discovered that.
How?
We were having words, really, and my ex said, well, we're threatening not being able to see the children, and it came out, she said, well, you won't get to see them anyway, they're not yours. And this applied to just one of them, actually. And
I mean, presumably at the start, were you taking it seriously what she was saying, or did you take it as read that she was telling you the honest truth?
Do you know what? It suddenly struck a chord. I thought, yes, I very originally when the pregnancy was announced, I sort of thought about it and I thought, this doesn't make sense. And then I guess I didn't want to know that, and I put it away for 4 years, and then it came back to haunt me. We'd never discussed it before then. I just assumed that I'd got dates wrong and so on, and then discovered it. But the story rolled on quite a bit from there. At the time, I was quite surprised. It didn't make any difference to me whatsoever. As far as I was concerned, he was my son. I loved him, brought him up, and I think it was mutual because he had no idea either. We got divorced, and then for the next 3 years I had regular access to him along with the other children. But things changed when he was 7, when my ex got remarried, and I haven't seen him since, actually. That's apart from a couple of days, in 10 years I've not really seen him, but I'm required to pay for him by court orders, which I can't seem to change, and I can't get access to him because the court says I don't have any right to access.
So some people might find that surprising that you're still having to pay for a son that isn't actually yours.
The court order was around his education originally. They were treating him as a child of the family, and I was ordered to pay for private education, which the other children were getting. And it's had a big consequence because as I rolled on, I've also got remarried. And when I got remarried, I just couldn't really afford the private education thing anymore. And had a long discussion with my ex saying, I can't do it anymore, recommend you take him out. And she didn't want to do it, but didn't object. And situation, I stopped paying then about 7 years ago. And 5 years ago, she came back with a court order saying that I hadn't paid for going on 3 years, and the heavy fees are sort of $25,000 a year type fees.
Yeah.
And she forced the sale of the house that I was in with my new wife in the court, and now we don't own a house. And my son is still in private education, and I still don't see him.
And
it's all been supported by the law. They said, it's unfortunate, it doesn't seem fair, but strictly with the word of the law, you're in the wrong. I feel quite hard done by, actually.
But also the kind of, away from the kind of financial aspect of it, which must be very, very difficult for you, but just park that to one side, just in terms of the psychological impacts. It's one thing, struggling to get as much time as you want to see your children from a breakdown of a relationship, but when it actually is, discovered that a child you thought was yours isn't, I mean, the actual emotional impact on you, Dave, how was that?
Yeah, it was significant. I was sad and disappointed, but actually, in the love sense, it didn't make any difference.
Right.
I always liken it to if I'd adopted a child, I wouldn't love them any less, if you see what I mean, than my other children. Yes,
well, exactly. We discussed this earlier on with a couple of other callers we were speaking to. That kind of bond that develops father and child, etc. That can't die, can it? Really, Dave. Thank you for your call. Let's go to another Dave in Worcester. The other side of the coin here, really, Dave, isn't it? You discovered that your father wasn't actually your father.
That's right. Yeah, I found out when I was 15 when my mum and dad split up, and I was fleeing with my mum, and in the conversation, the person that was with my mum said, is it the real father? And she let it slip, and she forgot that I was actually sat behind her. And that's how I found out, and then obviously it was explained to me properly then.
It was explained to you properly as a 15-year-old, which, 15-year-olds who go through divorce and things like that, we hear so much about what kind of potential psychological impact there can be from that. But for something like this, do you remember how you felt as a 15-year-old boy being told something like that?
Well, yes, I do, and it's a bit weird because at the time, being a 15-year-old, hormones, a bit rebellious, I was actually chuffed that he wasn't my dad. However, very shortly after, the penny dropped and I realised that I loved him, and of course, it makes no difference whatsoever if your dad that brings you up is your biological father or not. No difference at all.
But do you know who your biological father is?
Yes, and I met him for about 10 minutes when I was 15. It completely freaked me out because as soon as I'd spoken to him for a couple of minutes, and then I went to sit down at a table with him in a sort of a back room, a bar room, and he introduced me as his son. It freaked me out, and I never saw him again until about 18 months ago when I contacted him again. But just to add to this, and this is really cooking noodle, I was at school with somebody with the same surname as me in my class, and I'm dark-haired, he was ginger, and I didn't realise that this person was my cousin, blood cousin, and he knew all along.
He knew all along?
His parents had told him not to tell me, and that freaked me out.
Did you get on well with him? Was he all right?
Well, yes, I did, yeah, but this is even going to freak out even more, because what also happened was I have the same surname as my brother, who has a different father to me, but the person who is my father has the same surname as my dad who brought me up.
Right.
And so what's actually happened is my brother has my dad who brought me up, has his surname because my parents were together when my brother was born. I have the same surname because of my biological father.
Well, you know, families, they can be a complicated business, can't they?
Really deep, isn't it?
Dave, consider my noodle well and truly cooked. Thank you very much indeed for your call. Keep your calls and thoughts coming in on this one. 0500 909 693. You can text the show as ever, of course, on 85058. This issue of paternity fraud.